Hi, I'm Brian with BibleStudying.net, and in the last video segment we were talking about Islam, and we were talking about some of its historical issues and its acceptance of Old Testament and New Testament historical documents as valid. And so we kind of want to summarize here, stack up comparison. Islam, what does it give us as evidence? Well, it offers the Old and New Testament. Christianity, for example, as evidence. It offers no miracles. And so the whole thing is going to come down to a question of whether or not the Old and the New Testament point to Islam, that they tell us that we should believe Islam and Muhammad, or whether or not they tell us not to, and Muhammad falls outside of what Old Testament and New Testament believers can accept. And so that's why we're going to set that aside for another study. Next, I want to move forward and cover some other religions, such as Shinto. So what is Shinto? Well, Shinto is a Japanese religion. It's indigenous to Japan. And according to Britannica, they're going to give us a little more explanation here. Essentially, Shinto is a form of ancestor worship. According to Shinto myths, in the beginning, a certain number of kami simply emerged, and a pair of kami gave birth to the Japanese islands, as well as the kami who became the ancestors of the various clans. The Japanese imperial family claims descent from the sun goddess. And so you have these kami who are sort of supernatural beings, and then they are playing into the ancestry of the human race and the various clans of Japan in particular. And so it's a form of ancestor worship essentially. But when we ask historical questions, who founded it, what can we know about why we should believe it or why we shouldn't believe it, what evidence is given, here's what we find. We find that according to Britannica, Shinto has no founder. And according to Britannica, it has no founder and no official scripture. And as we look forward here, we ask, well, what about its ideology? Where does it get its ideology from? Why should we believe it or not? According to Britannica, Shinto, an early Chinese influence on Shinto. So Shinto is indigenous to sort of Japan, and so when we talk about Chinese influence, what are we talking about? Well, according to Britannica, Confucianism is believed to have reached Japan in the 5th century AD. So notice the dates. Confucianism reaches Japan in the 5th century AD. By the 7th century AD, it had spread among the people together with Chinese Taoism. So by the 7th century, you have Confucianism and Taoism, which is, as we saw, there's not really much of a line between Confucianism and Taoism in scholars' minds anyway today. All of these stimulated the development of Shinto ethical teachings. The encounter with Buddhism was officially introduced in Japan in AD 552, so 6th century, and it developed gradually. In the 8th century, there emerged tendencies to interpret Shinto from a Buddhist viewpoint. Shinto kami were viewed as protectors of Buddhism. Shrines for tutelary kami were built within the precepts of Buddhist temples, and in some cases Buddhist priests were in charge of the management of Shinto shrines. So we're going to have very good reason here to basically put Shinto, although it's definitely emphasizing a form of ancestor worship, into this sort of global category of polytheistic, pantheistic mysticism, because it's so inundated with influence from Taoism and from Buddhism. And notice that it was by the 8th century, so we had the inflow of Taoism, and by the 7th century we had Buddhism. In the 8th century, the view was to look at Shinto from with a Buddhist viewpoint. And so we look at those dates, the 6th century, 7th century, 8th century, and how much influence is coming into Japan from Buddhism and Taoism at that point. In the next quote here, we're going to talk about Shinto and its religious texts. According to the Columbia Encyclopedia, Shinto cannot be traced to its beginnings because until the 5th century AD, when Chinese writing was introduced to Japan, the myths and rituals of Shinto were transmitted orally. The written record of ancient beliefs and customs first appears and it's completed in AD 712. So the 8th century, the very point in time when Shinto is being influenced and looked at from a Buddhist viewpoint, is when the writings of Shinto are starting to be put together. Lastly, I want to talk here, just summarize where we're at with Shinto. According to the Columbia Encyclopedia, it's an ancient native religion of Japan, still practiced in a form modified by the influence of Buddhism and Confucianism, so that's sort of widely accepted and understood today, the Buddhist influence, the Taoist influence. And according to Britannica, it has no official sacred scriptures in the strict sense and no fixed dogmas, but has preserved its guiding beliefs throughout the ages nonetheless. And Columbia Encyclopedia says, in present-day Shinto, there is no dogmatic system and no formulated code of morals. So when we try to analyze this historically, we find that a lot of its content is going to be Buddhist, it's going to be Taoist. The writings are going to be potentially very much influenced by Buddhism and Taoism. And when we ask what it believes and why we should believe it, we find that Shinto has very few fixed dogmas, and it doesn't have any real scriptural attestation of those dogmas either. It has no identifiable founder. So not much going on historically that we can look at there and to validate or invalidate its claims. If we're looking for a religion that has objective evidence to believe it, it's going to be difficult to line that up with Shinto. Next, I want to talk about Sikhism. And what is Sikhism? And so we need to sort of identify that very quickly. And according to the American Heritage Dictionary, Sikhism is the doctrines and practices of a monotheistic religion found in northern India in the 16th century, combining elements of Hinduism and Islam. So it's a combination of Hinduism and Islam. And it's coming out of northern India. Well, even to this day, the clash between Muslim views and Hindu views in this part of the world is still very much alive. And so one of the effective cultural solutions that took place was the emergence of a view known as Sikhism today that effectively blended, to some extent, those competing ideologies in the attempt to bring peace between those two cultures. According to the Columbia Encyclopedia, Sikhism is heterodox, combining the teachings of Bhakti Hinduism and Islamic Sufism. So one of the questions, again, is this part of this global pantheistic, polytheistic mysticism? And on the Islamic side, it's monotheistic, but in general, can we connect it to mysticism? Well, first of all, we know that Hindu is mystical. And so those elements definitely are going to fall into that category. But what is Islamic Sufism? Because that was one of the components that came together and out of which Sikhism emerged. Well, Sufism, according to Britannica, is a mystical movement within Islam that seeks to find divine love and knowledge through direct personal experience of God. So Sufi Islam is the mystical area, the mystical branch of Islam. So on both sides, Sikhism, both in its Hinduism and its Islam, or its Muslim point of view, comes from a mystical tradition. Certainly should be put into, despite its monotheistic nature, should be put into the category of obvious influence, obvious development from the pantheistic, polytheistic, mystical worldview that's out there globally. So let's talk about the time frame here. The earliest source material on the founder of Sikhism, whose name is Nanak, are written within 50 to 80 years after his death. Most Sikh scholars reject them, however, and rely on the Guru's compositions, which were incorporated into the Adi Granth, which is their religious text. So we do have written material within 50 to 80 years of his life, but scholars reject that and favor instead the material that's in their scriptural text. So what is this Adi Granth, their scriptural text, and what's the time frame for it? Sikhism, it says there is only one canonical work, according to Britannica. It's the Adi Granth. It was compiled by the 5th Guru in 1604. And the version accepted by Sikhs as authentic is said to have been revised by another one of the Gurus in 1704. And the Adi Granth contains nearly 6,000 hymns composed by the first 5 Gurus. Additionally, we should know that according to Britannica, Sikhism, their article on Sikhism, the Gurus themselves disclaimed miraculous powers. And so what can we say about Sikhism on a historical level? What can we say? Well, its documentation is much closer to modern times. We're talking about the 16th, 17th century here, and even a little bit into the 18th century. So the availability of its documentation shouldn't be much of a problem on a historical scale. But what we find is that, in fact, there's nothing in the texts. The texts are largely in the sense of were poems and those types of things. And so in terms of a historical documentation, it contrasts strongly with the Old Testament, which is largely chronicling of Old Testament of history, just historical, straightforward narratives we find in the Old Testament. It's not what we find with the hymns, the 6,000 hymns that are in the scripture of the Sikhs. Also, they disclaim miraculous power, so they're not going to be drawing on that kind of confirmation. So what kind of confirmation really is there available to us if we want to ask what evidence is there for the claims of Sikhism? We don't really need to go that far, of course, because it's readily obvious, it's readily available where Sikhism gets its ideas. It gets them by combining the existing ideas of Islam and Hinduism. So largely, the point of view expressed in Sikhism is going to be something we can analyze by analyzing the historical evidence for those two religions. So I want to stop there for a second. We'll come back in a moment and talk about the last couple of religions here on our list.